Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. We have some more in the waiting room, so I'm going to give it one more minute as people join our call, and then we will get started. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us. We're really excited for the conversation today. All right, welcome again, everyone. My name is Dr. Katie Holland. I'll be kicking us off for our session today. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us. We're thrilled to have you here. I'll do a quick introduction and then we're going to get rolling. We have a 2-hour session today. I'll put the agenda in the chat shortly for you, but it was shared if you registered for the meeting as of yesterday. Hopefully you got that in your email and can follow along with us as we proceed through our program today. But this is a Road to Recovery, NABC, and AFWA sponsored session. We are co-hosting this conversation today focused on bird conservation on private lands from a U.S. state perspective. So many of you have joined us from Road to Recovery in the past for engagement sessions. But if not, know that this session is part of a series that is focused on bird conservation on private lands and what that means and how we as bird conservationists and bird enthusiasts can engage in private lands conservation work to not only conserve and protect habitat, but to recover critically declining bird species. So this is the third in this session. As we close later today, I'll let you know what's coming up as we continue this series focused on bird conservation and private lands. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Dr. Katie Holland. I am a conservation social scientist, and I'm currently a research scientist at Virginia Tech, where I serve as the National Bird Conservation Social Science Coordinator. And in that role, I have the pleasure and the privilege of working with Road to Recovery as their social scientist and with the North American Bird Conservation Initiative as co-chair of the Human Dimensions Subcommittee. So engaged in a lot of different bird conservation programs and work. I know I've connected with many of you in this call in different capacities, so it's great to see you here. And again, thanks for taking the time to join us. I'm co-hosting this session today with Dr. Bradley Wilkinson. Dr. Wilkinson is the Bird Conservation Program Manager for the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, as well as the U.S. coordinator of the North American Bird Conservation Initiative. Bradley's based in Washington, D.C., and focuses on issues of full annual cycle conservation, bridging the research implementation gap, and bringing together diverse perspectives for achieving conservation success. So it's the two of us and Shane Baylor, who is with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. Shane is the Agricultural Policy Program Manager for the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. He's from North Salem, New York, and studied environmental science, public policy, and agricultural economics at Clemson University. And a fun fact for you today is that Shane, Bradley, and I all are Clemson alums, so go Tigers. So our topic today, based on the number of people who have registered for this call and seeing all of you today, is one that I don't have to convince you is of high importance for bird conservation. So one of our presenters today, Sarah Barker, shared this slide with me. Sarah's with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And it really, I can't think of a better way to frame our conversations today. So birds need our help, and they need our help on private lands. The graph you see on the left of this slide is from the 2013 State of the Birds report, showing what percent of land is privately owned in each of these different biomes. The one on the right, I know many of you, probably all of you are familiar with. This figure is coming out of the Science article that documented the loss of 3 billion birds since the 1970s. And it was that article and that shocking realization that really energized and started the Road to Recovery initiative. And a lot of the work that all of our organizations are doing today to really focus strongly on bird recovery and intentional conservation delivery, which must include private lands. So our agenda for today, we have 3 parts. Part 1, we have 2 representatives from state wildlife agencies who will start off by sharing their perspectives on bird conservation and private lands and the work that their states are doing and how their roles really support private lands conservation delivery and partnerships. We'll then hear from partners. So there are a lot of organizations who serve as critical and key bridges between state agencies, federal agencies as well, and scientists and landowners, those who are actually owning and making the decisions on private lands. So including land trusts, joint ventures, and partner organizations. And then we hope to have some time to open it up for discussion and to engage all of you, hear your perspectives and your thoughts to for our speakers, but also to inform how we move this series on private lands conservation forward and bring us all together as a bird conservation community to really deliver this meaningful work. So I'm going to stop there and I am going to turn it over to Shane, who will introduce our speakers for part 1 of our session.
Thanks, Katie. So it's my pleasure to introduce Will Newman of the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. Will Newman is liaison for the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department to the USDA. He represents TPWD on statewide and interstate policy advisory committees, coordinates conservation partnerships, and provides training to agency staff, and delivers technical and policy guidance to inform the implementation of program resources for wildlife management on private lands. It's our pleasure to have Will here today. Turn it over to you, Will.
Hey, thanks, Shane. I confirm everybody can see my slide here. I appreciate the introduction. It's definitely my pleasure to talk today about private lands on sort of a state level scale and give a little perspective from the state of Texas, how we've had some success with our partnerships here. So just get us started. There's certainly a lot to be said about how the conservation community has prioritized our work to influence specifically habitat quality. Where we do have some clarity is that land use and management impact habitat, which in turn is an important factor for species population stability. But also over the past several decades, we've done a lot of good work and we've learned a lot. So I don't want to get too down. We would be way worse off and poorly prepared for the future without current stockpilings of conservation successes, advances, particularly in species and habitat knowledge through intensive research and investments in social science that allows us to better understand decision maker actions and ways to provide more effective advocacy and outreach. But as is evidenced by the 3 Billion Birds report, this collective effort thus far has been inadequate to prevent the decline in bird species. If we focus on habitat component of the bird decline, we're quickly confronted with the issue of scale. If our goals are to recover declining species and to keep common species common, then habitat perfection on a small scale isn't likely to get it done on its own. Likewise, expanses of poor to marginal habitat quality won't get it done either on its own. Full restorations often require intensive actions that are technically arduous and resource heavy. And when we have decision makers that are willing to take those steps, we must find ways to provide adequate guidance and resources to make it happen. In other cases, there are more extensive conservation opportunities when operational tweaks like implementation of prescribed fire or managed grazing can result in meaningful improvements to usable space if they're adopted broadly. Especially in the West, where tract sizes are larger, that could mean impacting a lot of acres through engagement with fewer decision makers. Either way, both scales are really important for us to be addressing concurrently. Depending on where you are in the country, there's a disproportionate amount of our species of greatest conservation need that are dependent on private lands. Katie showed us another slide on that earlier. So who are the decision makers that we need to reach? Well, for 61% of the land in the US, private landowners are the primary stewards. Here are some figures put together by the AFWA Private Lands Working Group that break down the regional proportion of land that is privately owned. And when we're discussing which states are private land states, we often cite a percentage of private ownership, which seems to disproportionately demonstrate a demarcation kind of between the East and the West. And but if we look at this map, which is a little hard to read on the screen with the percentages there, but it makes clear that in reality, most states are mostly private land states. So even the states that don't regularly refer to themselves as private land states are mostly over 50% privately owned. In fact, only 8 states in the West have private land ownerships of less than 50% of the land acres. But even in those Western states, private ag producers have a significant influence over public lands through grazing leases. It might also be helpful to look at it from the opposite direction. While 96% privately owned, only 1.9% of Texas is either federal or state land. So we have to rely on private landowners to be well informed and empowered to make bird compatible decisions with their land use. Here's what those public acres look like in Texas. When you put them on a map, it's easy to see that even if all of these acres were managed optimally for the appropriate native wildlife habitat from a broad conservation standpoint, it's just not enough to get us the quantity, quality, or connectivity that we need to prevent declines in bird species. Resiliency for most species requires suitable habitat characteristics on a landscape scale, extending well beyond the boundaries of public land management and onto privately owned lands. In Texas, there's a few key trends that drive some of our biggest challenges. The Texas Land Trends Report is developed by Texas A&M Natural Resources Institute, and it indicates some changing land uses. While around less than 1% of the population still owns 142 million acres of private working lands in the state, where land use is most compatible with habitat management. Over the last few years, well, since 1997 to 2022, there's been a net loss or conversion of 3.7 million acres of working lands converted to non-agricultural uses. These are lost opportunities for future conservation of habitat. Over 1.8 million acres of that loss has occurred in the last 5 years of that report. Also, our population is growing. We now have over 30 million Texans. We add about 950 people a day. Most of those people move to our major metropolitan areas, but that is also driving changes in land value, increases in land value. Most of that's around those areas, but which causes a lot of fragmentation concentrated in the areas between our metropolitan triangle there. But it's also causing some secondary fragmentation in rural areas as ex-urbanites and others buy recreational property or investment property in those regional areas where the tract sizes were previously large. And those, as those tracts reduce in size with fragmentation, we start to lose our potential to do habitat conservation on a large enough scale. Influencing private landowners to make habitat compatible decisions requires a level of trust, and it requires resources. Face-to-face interactions with knowledgeable professionals over time are necessary in order to build awareness, weigh out factors, and commit to a course of action, especially when those private landowners are being asked to significantly change their behaviors and expend their own resources. This capacity need is difficult to quantify. It's a challenge for our community to figure out how much we need in personnel in order to get this kind of work done. This figure is from the AFWA Private Lands Working Group. The QR code there will take you to the website where you can find more information from this working group. And it's based on a generalized estimate extrapolated to all the states. So lots of holes is preliminary effort here, but the map colors show the relative adequacy of collective private lands conservation delivery capacity. That's state agencies, federal agencies, NGOs, everybody's capacity together mapped out here and how close we are by color to meeting that capacity. The numbers indicate an estimated number of additional staff that would be needed in order to meet the challenge of providing good technical and financial assistance to private landowners. based on the number of customers and the area that could be effectively covered by a biologist. In addition to technical guidance capacity, many private landowners also need financial assistance to take on the cost of restoration or more active management. Conservation delivery programs for private lands need a diversity of tools that make both knowledge and resources available to a diversity of customers that make decisions based on a diversity of different factors. Because of that large need, no agency, no conservation interest group, university system, or NGO can deliver the resources necessary alone. Complementary conservation partnerships are the answer to our individual deficiencies. Pictured here, for example, are migratory bird joint ventures, a great geographic demonstration of these types of partnerships. While national efforts have strength in resource allocation, grassroots and local efforts are most effective at engaging decision makers. However, geography, ecosystem delineations, administrative and regulatory jurisdictions all tend to set an effective planning and delivery scale around the state level. Building partnerships to deliver conservation at that state level allows us to connect with most effectively with adequate resources while staying engaged with a broad diversity of partners that can provide that local perspective and accountability to those local issues. They can bring more focused expertise and resources to the table. Organizational diversity is a challenge, but it can also be the solution. Collectively, partnerships' voices are louder. Initiatives with holistic benefits are easier to fund and easier to market to a diverse audience. Effective partnerships match strengths to program and resource opportunities in ways that resolve those limitations of our individual constituencies. For example, government agencies have limited capacity to advocate, limited administrative agility, and may have limitations on the number of employees. But often we have regulatory authority, public familiarity, and offer long-term organizational stability. Whereas an NGO might lend credibility to a certain stakeholder group, bring eligibility for other grant opportunities, or hold deed restrictions on a conservation easement, for example. Recognize that organizational members of a conservation partnership are not always going to have the same stance on every issue. But if we can find common ground in conservation and bring something into the partnership, we can make progress where we have that common ground and set aside the rest. Perhaps the most important to success is that at the state scale, these partner organizations are represented by individual people that develop trust over time through their familiarity with each other, and they leverage those interpersonal relationships and their personal talents to deliver conservation to a diverse landscape much more effectively. We need everybody at the table. I'm going to shift gears a little bit to speak specifically about state wildlife agencies and provide some examples of how one state has supported partnerships to deliver conservation to private lands through a diverse set of partnerships through a couple of different programs. While all state fish and wildlife agencies look very different from each other, with some varying organizational structure, politics, allocations of resources, their authorities are different. Our primary purposes are consistent. State fish and wildlife agencies are responsible for managing, legally responsible for managing fish and wildlife on public and private lands and water within their geographic jurisdictions. Most state agencies support each other through engagement with national partners and through the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. In recent years, AFWA and the Private Lands Working Group has been working to tackle some of the challenges in conservation delivery on private lands by sharing our state level successes and identifying some limitations that we all have in common to see if we can resolve some of those issues. And you can find some of the products of that work, including several case studies from individual states, including some of the things I'm going to talk about today from Texas. You can find that on the website by scanning the QR code here. One unique program in Texas is the Pastures for Upland Birds program. This program restores converted exotic pasture or cropland back into native grassland cover. It's very simple by design and therefore very popular with the folks that we designed it for. This program is unique because there's no direct exchange of financial resources. It's technical guidance provided, conservation planning, and then the program purchases herbicide and the appropriate seed for a restoration project, and then makes the equipment available to do the work. The landowner commits to follow the conservation plan to establish the cover, and then there's a 10-year habitat retention contract that holds them accountable for that investment of public resources. Very popular program, readily adopted. We use all the money every year very quickly. So this program is administered by Texas Parks and Wildlife through our around 100 or so private lands biologists. We have someone that covers every county. Most cover 2 to 3 counties. They have a lot of other responsibilities, but this is one of the things that they can choose to do if it's appropriate for their landowners. This project started, though, as a conversation, an idea between a local biologist with Texas Parks and Wildlife and an extension agent with Texas A&M AgriLife. They were made aware of an opportunity through NRCS with a Conservation Innovation Grant to do a pilot for this project. They put together a program, were awarded some funding to execute that for a couple of years, and were very successful over that time period in showing some demand and demonstrating a new way to deliver conservation. After the SIG grant was done, the success of that model was used to engage other sources of funding in order for us to continue the project. But now, Pastures for Upland Birds serves as an example to both new and older partners to emulate the successes of the project within their own programs. Several participants of the program, the landowners, have gone on to engage in much more extensive habitat work using a variety of programs, and many of those have been recognized in our state-level Lone Star Land Steward Award. And some of those folks have gone on to be an example and form communities of practice with their neighbors in their local communities, and have even gone on to establish new organizations or chapters of organizations that are now partners on new programs and new opportunities for conservation. Texas Parks and Wildlife engages directly with the USDA in and out of the state in order to provide input on program delivery and technical guidance. Often this is done at the State Technical Advisory Committee through resource concern focused groups, subcommittees that are made up of stakeholder groups. It's a good place for other conservation organizations to engage as well. We spend a lot of Farm Bill funding in Texas, and I know previous sessions have covered a lot of the Farm Bill funds, but because we spend so much in Texas, it's a huge investment for us to influence just some of those dollars. It's huge for Texas Parks and Wildlife and our goals. The department also, our private lands program staff leverages state resources and agency relationships with our other partners to develop effective projects and engage with NRCS at the state level through the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. This is a year old now. We now have 3 more projects on this map that we're working on. But one example of a Regional Conservation Partnership project that's been really helpful is the Oaks and Prairies Joint Venture, their Grassland Restoration Incentive Program. It's a great example of the capacity for a partnership, because for more than 10 years, it has delivered millions of dollars in over 140,000 acres of private lands, grassland habitat in Texas. And that's done through a partnership of dozens of organizations. And it's served not just in those habitat outcomes, but we've developed conservation professionals along the way and long-lasting partnerships that we've leveraged into other projects. Partnerships enabling conservation delivery and conservation enabling more partnerships. So finally, I wanted to talk about this one. The Amphibian and Reptile Conservancy was recently awarded a new RCPP project to recover the endangered Houston toad through conservation delivery on private lands. This is a Texas Parks and Wildlife supported, very diverse partnership, And we've leveraged the urgency and resources brought by a non-bird endangered species to restore and manage holistically a native ecosystem. The work we do in this project will explicitly benefit grassland and savanna bird species in a highly fragmented landscape where we were having trouble finding resources to fund program opportunities in this area to do post oak savanna restoration and blackland prairie restorations. We now have an avenue to fund those types of projects just by bringing in another partner in the Amphibian and Reptile Conservancy. The resilience provided by the state agency allowed for investments in partnerships. Those partnerships brought people together around meaningful conservation work. A state-scale community of practice is delivered to the ground through personnel working directly with private landowner decision makers. Engaged participants go on to change the culture of land use in their own communities. Bringing your bird conservation priorities, expertise, and resources into this process requires engaging with these partnerships at the state level at the appropriate part in the process. Migratory bird joint ventures and your state wildlife agencies are a good place to find where those opportunities exist. If you don't know who to contact, you can reach out to me or Katie, and I bet we can get you pointed in the right direction. That's all I have.
Thanks for that fantastic presentation, Will. It's now my pleasure to introduce Joe Roy of the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. Joe Roy is the private lands wildlife biologist for the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. He's the chair of the North American Bird Conservation Initiative's Private and Working Lands Subcommittee. In his personal life, him and his wife and 2 dogs manage a small homestead where they raise pigs, goats, geese, ducks, and chickens. Joe is an avid birder and enjoys hunting, fishing, traveling, gardening, forest management, and competitive powerlifting. Joe, turn it over to you.
Thanks, Shane. I'm gonna make sure I can get my screen share up here real quick. So 1 second. All righty. Does that look all right, folks?
We don't see your screen, Joe.
Second, it's not working here. All right.
There we go.
Yeah, let me just get the proper mode here. All righty, how's that look?
Good.
Perfect. Alrighty, folks, nice to be here with you all today. Thank you for that introduction, Shane, and happy to be speaking with some of my colleagues from across the state and across the country, both as presenters and in attendance. So my name's Joseph Roy. I'm the private lands wildlife biologist for the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. And today I'm hoping to build off a little bit of the conversation that Will laid out with some of the higher level approaches that states can use and talk a little bit about specific approaches we take here in Maine. In Maine, our private lands program within the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife is relatively new in terms of program length. It was formed in 2020. And so we've really been building the program from the ground up since then and learning from a lot of our partners, many of whom are here today, on how to help develop a program like this, and one that focuses on all of our species in the state, but particularly our species of greatest conservation need, which includes a lot of our priority bird species. So I want to give folks a little bit of information about Maine, just so we understand the context of where we're working here. Maine's 23 million acres in size and has about 1.3 million residents, with our largest industries being the forest products, life science, marine and aquaculture, food and agriculture, and outdoor recreation. So as you can see here, a lot of our state's industry is focused around natural resources, whether their use or their observation, which I think creates a really strong land ethic here in Maine and makes a lot of people really connected to the resources that we're here to talk about. You know, in terms of our size, we're like 39th size by land area, 43rd this size by population, and our land is really tied up in about half of it being organized territories where there's not a lot of full-time or any full-time residents, and the other half being or half of it being unorganized territories and half of it being organized territories. And in Maine, similar to Texas, we're pretty much privately owned. We're 94% privately owned in the state, a lot of that being corporate ownership, which usually is in the form of industrial forest land. And then we also have our standard, what we would consider our family woodland owners. And then we have a small amount of federal land in the form of a national park and a couple of refuges. And then our public land is largely contained within one really large state park and a bunch of smaller state parks and state parcels throughout the state. Some of these numbers have increased a little bit in the last couple of years, so the image you're seeing on your screen isn't 100% accurate. There's a little bit more public land on the landscape, but we're still at 94% privately owned. And in Maine, we're 89% forested. So by percentage, we're the most forested state in the country, which means that a lot of our land is a privately owned forest, which gives us great opportunities to manage for, especially some of our forest dwelling birds. Will mentioned this in his presentation about Texas, and it kind of a similar trend here in Maine. We're seeing changes on the landscape. So not only are we seeing challenges with managing for these species in the light of climate change and other issues, we're also seeing it in conversion and development of property. So in some areas, we're seeing our rural areas go away as urban and suburban populations increase, and the associated energy production needed for that and development needed for that. And we're seeing some land conversion, particularly in the southern and middle part of the state, which are already where our hubs of populations reside. We've talked a little bit about what Maine looks like, and now I want to just mention briefly what our bird communities look like here. Over the course of record, we've got about 475 species of birds that have been recorded to have been spotted in Maine. That includes rarities and vagrants and our migratory birds. But of those, we have about 233 species breeding here in Maine. And of our species that are occurring here in Maine, about 130 of them are species of greatest conservation need. So it's highlighting that we're a really important area for both habitat needed for breeding and production, but also for layover habitat, migration habitat, and large unfragmented forest blocks. So now that we've kind of painted the picture of what Maine looks like, what Maine has, and what we have for bird communities and land cover, I just want to say, as we start to develop our ways to manage for private lands on the landscape, especially in the context of our species of greatest conservation need and our birds in our state, we really have to look to our partners. While the program at Inland Fisheries and Wildlife is in its infancy, there's been a lot of partners who are working on the landscape, working on natural resource management that we can engage with and support as we work towards our wildlife habitat management goals. And so thankfully, one of our partners is going to be presenting a little bit later today on their work, the New England Forestry Foundation. So I saved all their great information for them to present, but we're going to go over a couple of our partners here that we're working with and a couple of the programs that we're working with in the state of Maine to help promote our conservation needs for our bird species statewide. So like Will mentioned in his presentation, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, plays a large role in management here in Maine. And in my capacity as a private lands biologist, I've been able to add a lot of technical assistance to that agency by serving on the State Technical Committee and chairing the Wildlife Subcommittee to the State Technical Committee. So in this capacity, I can help provide wildlife-focused priorities and engagement, technical assistance to both staff and to landowners in state offices and in regional offices to help figure out ways to take current operations and just make them a little bit more friendly for our wildlife species, in particular our forest bird species and our species of greatest conservation need. Gives me a really good opportunity to tap into other people's work. I always joke, I invite myself to everyone else's party and then talk about wildlife while I'm there, and they seem to keep inviting me, so that works out well. And then I can help bring some of the expertise that our agency has and some of the knowledge that our agency has into these work plans that already exist. We also work a lot with our Maine Forest Service, which is on the ground with forested landowners, primarily focusing on forest production and forest health concerns. But as this program has developed here at Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, that landowner outreach forester that serves statewide and the Maine Forest Service district foresters who serve regionally have really been open to talking a lot bit more about wildlife and forest management as a component of wildlife habitat needs, particularly our bird species. So it's been really easy for me to engage with people who are already working on the ground. And I think that's a really good strategy for most states, is to just figure out who the key players are and just show up and help them bring wildlife into their work plan. And so, as I've said, we're 94% private and 89% forested. So one of the first places that we see as us being able to provide that biggest impact is engaging with landowners through forestry. Like we talked about earlier, one of our largest industries is the forest industry. And so there's a lot of forest management occurring in the state, and a lot of large blocks of land are still kept as forest for that industry. So we're going to talk a little bit now over some of the things that we do in that forestry space to help engage with the landowners and engage with the technical service providers and foresters to help provide that technical assistance that they are looking for. One thing we do is we do a lot of forest management plan reviews. There are certain forest management plans in the state of Maine, some funded by Natural Resource Conservation Service, some funded by the Maine Forest Service, and others that are part of our current use tax program that require some element of wildlife to be worked in, wildlife management standards to be worked into them, or at least for the agency to respond with some information about wildlife. So this has been a really easy way to just tap into an existing network of people. We review about 700 plans annually, and we provide maps of the occurring rare, threatened, or endangered habitat that's present, the species that may occur there, and then we can provide them with some technical guidance and recommendations for how to manage those species within that framework. So I always tell people, the way I think of it is, most foresters I talk with tell me, I'm not a biologist, but I know what a bird is and I know what a deer is. But I can make the forest look like what it needs to look like if you tell me what it needs here. And so it works out really well because a lot of our landowners are really interested in this conservation. A lot of the foresters really want to provide it, but they might not have had the technical training to make the stand look the way it needs to for, let's say, a chestnut-sided warbler. So they can call me and we can work together and help develop that plan and make sure that gets delivered on the ground. So it's a really good tool. It engages with a lot of landowners, a lot of foresters, and it gives us a great opportunity to get our name out there and our services out there quite a bit. One program here in Maine that we have is called the Forestry for Maine Birds program. This was developed by the Maine Audubon Society with help from a lot of partners, including the Maine Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, Maine Forest Service, just to mention a few. This is developed 3 targeted guides that are to assist private landowners and forest managers as they develop plans for bird-focused forest management, but also just helps teach them ways to identify the characteristics within our forest that the birds of interest might need. So we've identified 20 priority bird species, created species profiles, come up with bird-focused forest inventory metrics, whether that's the amount of coarse woody material on the ground or soft or small woody material, or the patch size openings that those species may need. And we've come up with forest recommendations for those species so they can be integrated into the existing forest management plans that are on the landscape and integrated into new forest management plans. So another thing that this guide series has come up with is it's come up with a series of maps and informational panels on the different forest communities we have here in Maine. So our northern hardwoods, our northern softwoods, our oak pine forest, and our northern mixed woods, and highlighted what species are expected to use those, what practices you can apply silviculturally in that landscape to promote certain species, and what habitat features those species are trying to key in on. And it really highlights the importance of these different habitat characteristics. And this has been wildly popular. It's 3 versions. One of them is designed for foresters and technical service providers. One of them is designed for landowners, and one of them is designed for our loggers. So we have a large guide that's spiral bound, dozens and dozens of pages with really detailed information. We have a smaller guide that looks more like an 8.5 by 11 pamphlet that you can, or booklet you can open up and see large pictures. And then we have a even smaller guide that has is a brochure that you can open up. It's one page front and back. That's a lot of great details. We know our loggers are using that because we find copies of them with grease on them. We find copies of them with pitch on it, and we know that they're getting used and they're of interest. So it's been really a great program that our agency has tried to help support, both with landowners, loggers, and foresters. And like I said, we have these 20 species profiles, and these are extremely popular. It talks about one of the species of concern, or the priority bird species. In this example, Blackburnian warblers. It provides a diagram on what stand type you can expect this species in, what features it needs, what kind of nest it has, where in the strata of the forest does the nest occur, where's most of their activity taking place, and how you can manage for that on the landscape. And one thing that's really great is it ties it to known and existing silvicultural practices that foresters and landowners are already familiar with. So they're just learning that they can apply these things differently to promote bird conservation. And that's been a really good tool that we've been able to support as an agency. Now, I know I've talked a lot about forestry today, but I do want to take a little bit of time to talk about another program our agency supports that focuses on our non-forested habitats, which admittedly are quite limited in Maine, but because they're quite limited, the species really rely on them. And one of our major programs that we're supporting is Ag Allies. This was a locally developed and led program that started out of a soil and water conservation district with one passionate individual who really cared a lot about grassland bird conservation. It's supported as one of Cornell's Land Trust Conservation Collaboratives, which we're going to hear a little bit more about today. And it's really based around agriculture and grassland birds from the onset of the program, but now we've expanded a little bit more into the hobby farmers, or folks who might have large lawns that they're able to delay mowing on or work collaboratively with. So we put a lot of time and effort into promoting this program and working with the existing framework. A lot of these landowners are already connected with Natural Resource Conservation Service management plans, and are already familiar with active management. And this is really a win-win where we can talk about ways to manage for important species while still meeting on-farm goals and objectives. So in this position, I've been able to support this organization a lot. We provide technical assistance, and the organization has some financial support to provide financial assistance for landowners who are undertaking delayed mowing, and also for landowners who are working to change their mowing cycle. So there may not be a financial assistance available for everyone, but oftentimes when we're working with some of our producers, depending on their herd of cattle, or their hay needs, they might say, "I've got to pick one spot to be the last spot I mow or graze anyways. Can you come out and tell me where all the bobolink are, and we can avoid that spot and go there last?" So oftentimes it's just a change of management style that doesn't have any negative financial implication on the foresters, on the farmers, and it results in a lot more bird activity. And I mean, if you're looking at this photo here, a bobolink is a really easy species to sell. It's got a unique call. Our foresters often refer to them as their Star Wars birds because they think they sound like a drone from the movie. And a lot of times when I engage with a landowner and with a farmer, they've never known that this was what the bird was. And once we've described it to them and shown it to them, they're like, "Oh, I've seen those for years. They've always been here," and they're really apt and interested to take care of them. So it's a really easy species to sell conservation for, and we've had a lot of success both in the land trust capacity and in the individual landowner capacity. And our farmers have been really receptive, and we have a lot of farmers who are now returning every year for 5, 6, 7 years at this point. We also do education and outreach to organizations who work with these farmers, and provide a lot of on the ground training for volunteers and other staff to go out and do some of these surveys. We did about 125 sites last year, representing about 12,794 farm acres, 3,694 field acres, and 2,289 acres of bobolink nesting habitat, which contained 605 pair of nesting bobolink, which was a really great metric to just show our landowners and our farmers that they're the ones who are leading to that conservation. And the nice thing here too is a lot of these farmers have other resource concerns. So while we might be there to start this conversation about bobolink, we can leave and come back talking about their forest management or their field edge management or some of the water quality concerns that they may have, and really just expand the conversation into a great conservation-minded farm that they're really proud of. And a lot of these folks have then turned them into demonstration areas where they want to bring people back and show them what they have on the landscape, like you're seeing in this photo right here. So I want to wrap this up here with have a couple minutes left, but I'm done a little early, which is unusual for me. But I just want to say, here in Maine, conservation of birds is a team effort. It's only accomplished through partners. And as this agency develops our private lands program more, it's just going to be working to build more capacity with existing partners and to help identify new partners who can help provide solutions to some of our conservation needs here in the state of Maine. If you have any questions, this is my contact info. Please feel free to reach out. If I don't know who you need to talk to, I can find the person for you, and more than happy to just talk about anything wildlife and anything Maine. So thank you for this time today.
Thanks, Joe. That was another great presentation. I believe we now have time for a couple questions, so feel free to put them in the chat or just unmute yourself, whatever you prefer. And I believe Bradley is going to moderate those questions.
Thanks, Shane. Yeah, if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and we'll get the ball rolling. I can ask one question while people take a minute to think and process. And this is a question for Will. At the end of your presentation, one of the things you mentioned was providing information to partnerships to help guide them in their conversations with landowners. But one thing that you mentioned was that it was important to get that information at the right time. So I was hoping for our partners who are looking to provide that information, what is the right time and how do you know when that time may be to start getting in contact with the groups that you work with and maybe your state agency as well?
Yeah, thanks, Bradley. I think maybe time is not the best word, but really just the best opportunity. And so it kind of depends on what you're bringing to the partnership and what your goals are, what kind of organization you're representing is going to determine where you fit into an existing partnership, and what kind of partners you might be able to bring to yourself in order to build in a new direction if that's necessary as well. So a good starting place are sort of the baseline structural organizations that have that long-term resiliency, and often that's state wildlife agencies. And here more often, it's also the migratory bird joint ventures. So I don't think there's a lot of reason to wait, like time-wise, but if you think you have something to add, you have input on technical things or on how programs could be designed, or how to reach landowners or decision makers more effectively, then reaching out and finding out who is doing that kind of work now, and where you might be able to fit in is the most important thing. Just get started.
Thanks for that, Will. Anything to add, Joe?
I think Will covered it perfectly.
It looks like in the chat we have a lot of conversation about the success of the Forestry for Maine Birds program and asking if there were opportunities in other states to develop that language, or if there's other states that has that. I was wondering, maybe Joe, in that context then, how I guess how was the technical information pulled to develop those guides, and if a bird conservation group or a species working group would like to review those documents and provide input, what would be a constructive way to do that?
Yeah, so first off, there are several other guides nationwide that have been independently developed. The guide for Forestry for Maine Birds was inspired partially by a similar guidance that came out of Vermont, and then it was developed in Maine, with Maine Audubon being the lead, and the Forest Stewards Guild playing a big role, as well as state and other state agencies. And so, I think that the first thing to do is, check our existing guide, see if you like it, learn something from it, and then if you see the contact information in there, you can reach out to any one of us to kind of figure out if there's something going on in your region. In terms of the input, I wasn't part of the agency at the time when the guide was developed. Sally Stockwell was a key component here, and she's in the chat answering questions for me, which I really appreciate. Thank you, Sally. And it really just pulled in a lot of the existing partners who are working in the space and developed input and feedback from many folks in many different agencies. Just making sure connecting with the right entities who are working in the space that you're looking for, but then also working with the species that you want to promote is a key component there. So
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? I guess if there's no other questions for now, we can keep rolling with our list of presenters. And yeah, please keep questions you have in mind coming in the chat, or like I said, raise your hand at the end of the next session and we can circle back. But in the meantime, thank you, Joseph and Will, for leading us for part one.
Yeah, thanks for those great presentations. And both Will and Joe emphasized the importance of partnerships and really finding the right combinations of partners to bridge these huge gaps and really engage landowners. And we know from the sessions that Road to Recovery has hosted on social science and bird conservation in the past, how big of a component trust is in working on private lands. And I think these partner organizations are really critical to that. So that leads us into part two, where we'll hear from some examples of these amazing partner organizations. So our first speaker is Sarah Barker from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, the Land Trust Program. Sarah is a conservation biologist at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and is the program director for the Cornell Lab Trust Bird Conservation Initiative. She provides strategic planning resources, technical assistance, planning tools, and funding opportunities to advance the pace and impact of land trust protection and stewardship efforts. She also assists land managers and practitioners in managing habitat for priority bird species and strives to build capacity for land trust and private lands community around birds. Sarah, thanks for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Katie. And good afternoon, everyone. Can you see my slides all right?
Yes, looks good.
Excellent. Okay. Well, as Katie said, I'm Sarah Barker. I'm from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And I want to add to this conversation about engaging with private landowners to really help support decision-making on the ground, as we've developed a model through our Land Trust Initiative program to engage with a group of conservation organizations that have a wide reach to the private lands community. So I'll share how building strategic conservation partnerships with land trusts, these are community-based nonprofit organizations that actively work to permanently conserve land, so how they can amplify your bird work and address the conservation of tipping point species on private lands, as well as showcase some of the ways this program model is really helping to build success stories. So given the 2013 State of the Birds report on private lands that Katie had mentioned, we saw a nexus between bird conservation work that many of us in this session are doing and land trust protection and stewardship efforts. So since land trusts protect over 61 million acres of privately owned lands nationally, and they reach over 6.4 million people through their programs and activities, they really have a huge amount of traction with conservation-minded private landowners and could help broaden our reach to a greater number of these landowners rather than just have an impact one parcel at a time. And there are also many ways that birds can help leverage that land trust work and really build capacity for these groups within this private land network, since, as we know, birds are great bioindicators of healthy ecosystems. There's a wealth of data for all taxa, bird taxa across habitats in North America, and there's also a huge birding community to engage and for attracting new audiences. So in 2013, we reached out to Land Trust to really help us learn how bird conservation information could support land trust work, and then how best to deliver and share that information. So we conducted a national needs assessment And this was with Ashley Dare when she was a postdoc back at Cornell. And we did targeted interviews, and there were 3 main outcomes. So land trusts need more funding to incorporate birds into their conservation work. They want better access and understanding of the conservation resources around birds. And then they also expressed a strong desire for monitoring support, access to expert advice, and planning tools. So with that in mind, and in consultation with the Land Trust Alliance, and this is basically the educational arm for all land trusts throughout the country, the Cornell Lab built the Land Trust Bird Conservation Initiative with the goal of bringing together those bird conservation partners and land trusts. So we created a website. This includes a bird-related fundraising directory. We have a bird conservation resources to support engagement. We also display planning documents and management guides. We give workshops throughout the country. We educate the private lands community about bird tools and how they can support land conservation and planning efforts. And we also provide many success stories to demonstrate how land trusts have integrated birds into their conservation work and show those interested just how to get started. So we also teach the land trust and conservation communities how to use eBird and also its associated science data as decision support tools, really to do things such as inform grant applications and involve landowners and volunteers in participatory science, build capacity for land trusts by engaging the birding community to collect data for your organization to really help meet your stewardship requirements. And then also do things such as assess management and assist with prioritization, land prioritization and planning. So then in 2017, to specifically address that need for more targeted funding that came out of that needs assessment, we started an annual grant program. And this provides funding to land trust awardees and their partners to facilitate high priority bird focused conservation projects. So in 2024, we awarded 6 $5,000 grants to support capacity building and partnership development, and then also 8 $25,000 grants to support active management, restoration, and stewardship work. And this is in a way that enhances habitat and promotes bird conservation. We also award a solicited $50,000 grant to one of the program's existing conservation collaboratives, which is something I'll just touch on in a moment. And then there's an annual, the annual RFP for the $5,000 and $25,000 grants. That opens the first week of January. Applications are due on March 1, and then funding is awarded around the middle of May. And this year, I'm excited to announce that we're increasing those $5,000 grants to $10,000 so we can offer more money for the capacity grants. And so the Cornell Lab, through the Land Trust team, we really act as partners and technical advisors for each of these projects, so we can be more intimately involved in most granting agencies and really help to grow and leverage each project for those partnering groups. So we also build what we call conservation collaboratives, and these are bringing clusters of regional or neighboring land trusts and bird conservation partners together around a common set of goals to focus efforts on landscape scale conservation and high priority birds in places where protection and management are most needed, but also where it can be most effective. So as the R2R working groups are also demonstrating, strategic and coordinated efforts across these landscapes or regions can really substantially increase the impact and cost effectiveness of conservation. So land trusts and bird partners within these collaboratives, they amplify their efforts and build capacity by leveraging collective resources, working together to secure funds, and then they're able to attract broader attention from media, funders, and their communities as well. And since we all know that birds aren't restricted to political boundaries, they really make great tools to help build relationships and scale these types of partnerships into regional efforts. So we currently have 6 collaboratives, official collaboratives. One of them is Ag Allies that Joe mentioned. And I'm going to mention one that is associated with the Golden Winged Warbler Working Group, which is currently supported by R2R. So this is the Western Vermont Collaborative, and this is led by Mark Labar from Audubon, Vermont, and the Vermont Land Trust. So they map and prioritize important areas in the Champlain Valley of Vermont for winged warblers. and they develop conservation strategies to help achieve management goals. They also conduct outreach with land trusts throughout the region, really working to leverage and share resources and funding. And then they also implement management practices for early successional and young forest habitats that will help create these connected habitats for golden-winged warblers throughout the Champlain Valley. And so the map that you see here shows all the sites where they're currently doing or have done implementation projects, trying to create sort of that golden chain of connectivity throughout that region. So in summary here, if you're looking to connect with private land audiences, these are some of the steps that we have considered and had success with. So use birds as effective ambassadors for conservation work. So essentially consider your delivery. We pitch birds as tools. So basically what birds can do for you or private landowners instead of focusing on that landowner's stewardship responsibility. So think about flipping that message, right? And showing them how they can put birds to work for them. Take time to build relationships with your landowners and partners that they trust. So consider bringing land trusts into your working groups as partners to help make those connections. So tap into groups such as land trusts that essentially speak the private landowner language and their trusted voices. Consider tying a landowner's property or community into the larger global ecosystem and connecting it to researcher impacts. So for example, you could show off the massive bobolink migration and hotspots where these declining grassland birds are moving through or breeding by looking at eBird model data products. Or like one of our land trust grantees is doing in Pennsylvania, they share visuals such as MODIS maps with their landowners to demonstrate how these birds are actually using their particular fields. So stressing that each property is important and plays a role in this larger landscape conservation picture. You can use funding sources as opportunities to collaborate with partners and create new lasting relationships, as well as stretch resources to build capacity. So if you're interested in land management or restoration projects, or really building an outreach or educational platform, you could consider partnering with a land trust and then applying for one of our land trust program grants for seed funding, or look to see what states have land trust conservation partnership grants available. And finally, this type of conservation work would not be possible without landowners and farmers who are willing to and open to try something new. So offer outreach and conduct listening sessions that can lead to furthering goodwill. You could consider participating in a volunteer workday through a land trust to meet some of their membership base, and engage land trusts in your region in your conservation delivery to really help build those partnerships. So thanks everyone. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or thoughts that you'd like to share. I've included my email on this slide and also provided Katie with some links to the resources that I mentioned, which I believe will be shared after this session. So I'd certainly look forward to hearing from all of you. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Sarah. It's such an awesome program, and hopefully one that many on the call, if they haven't been engaged with already, can find ways to connect in the future. I will be sharing resources out after the call, so feel free. I'll gather the ones that are being shared in the chat, so continue to do that. If you have questions for Sarah, we're going to have a question and answer session for all of the presenters once we get through our part two, jumping ahead of myself. There isn't even a part 4. Our part 2 presentations, but do feel free to put them in the chat in the meantime so you don't lose them, and we can bring them back up at the end there. So our next speaker is Matt Smith. Matt is a conservation delivery manager for Playa Lakes Joint Venture, whose mission is to conserve the playas, prairies, and landscapes of the Western Great Plains through partnerships for the benefit of birds, other wildlife, and for people. Matt is in transit today, so I will share slides here. Matt, thanks so much for joining us.
You bet, and thanks, Katie, for the introduction and the opportunity for speaking with everybody today and telling our story a little bit. I am not driving. I'm sitting in the car, but I'm not driving, so you won't be watching a car wreck on Zoom or anything here. So just relax.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, there we are.
We're good.
All right, thank you. So this story I want to tell here today a little bit. This is about seeking relevance and kind of our journey in that quest is to find out how we can be relevant with our work to people in our landscape. And as Will illustrated really well, I mean, this is a private lands dominated landscape where we work within our JV within the 6 states. It's almost, 95% or greater private lands. But within that landscape there, that gray area you see on the screen, that is the aquifer for this region, the Ogallala Aquifer that you probably heard quite a bit about. I mean, that fuels a tremendous ag economy in this region. It's kind of the breadbasket of the country, in irrigation, and water has made that possible. Now, on top of that landscape, on top of the aquifer, primarily are playa wetlands. And I'll go into a little bit more of what those are if you're not familiar with them here in a minute. But the blue there, it looks like it's covered up, but it's kind of at scale there. But there's at least 80,000 separate playa wetlands that cover this area. And those wetlands are a source of recharge for that aquifer. And so that's kind of the key that I want to talk about here in the story we're going to tell around this a little bit. But this map kind of sets that up and kind of gives you a visual of what we're going to be talking about. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so playas, they're basically can be very small, just a few acres up to hundreds of acres of wetlands, and they're depressional wetlands, and they have kind of a clay layer that holds that water up. They're not really connected to groundwater, and they're the lowest point on the landscape. So that's kind of where the water will tend to go after rains. I mean, they're very much rain fed, but we do describe them as recharge wetlands because they do have a connection to the underlying aquifer. Sometimes that aquifer can be fairly close to the surface, and sometimes it could be quite a ways, from the surface. So that water, as it goes down, it may take years to reach the aquifer. It may take decades to do that, but there's no question that water is going down, and eventually it will reach the aquifer. So when these playas are healthy, they're surrounded by grass. They have a grass kind of a buffer around them that helps protect them. When they're not so healthy, they may be within cropland. They're being farmed. They may have been leveled. They may have been drained. There may be terraces. There may be all kinds of things that keep the water out of those and make them more farmable. And so part of our big job is try to find ways to restore these kind of systems. And like we were saying, they're almost all found on private lands, not public lands. Next slide. Okay, so finding relevance. It's really not about going out and trying to find new partners, because you can do that, but it's difficult to do that and finding the right people. But when you do find that relevance and how you relate to people and what's important to them, then all of a sudden those partners, they're going to find you. So how do we find those on our journey? Next slide. Well, it's really pretty simple. It's about listening and listening to people. And so we went on a human dimensions kind of a journey, and we're still on one. We're still on many different ones right now, as a matter of fact. But this one we started in 2006. We started with a survey asking landowners and producers, what are the important conservation issues to you? I mean, what matters to you? And the number one thing on their list was the aquifer, and water. That was the number one conservation issue that was important. And so many of those same folks, didn't know anything about playas and whether or not they recharge the aquifer. But we started looking at this a little bit more, and we knew if that's the number one thing, and we knew about the recharge aspect of playas. So we really started kind of talking more about that in our literature and our messaging and our, outreach and marketing kind of things that we promoted and produced. It kind of started talking about that connection to the aquifer and recharge. And so we wanted to dive in a little bit more into this and kind of refine our messaging even more. So we conducted some landowner focus groups to say, what would it take for you to do conservation on playas? And, would you be willing to do conservation work for playa restoration? And most of them said, yes, but I really have to know, and I have to be convinced, that this was a real thing. This recharge was a real thing. It needed to come from a credible source. I don't know if I believe you. Who are you? Kind of thing. And so our next task was, okay, let's get some experts together, some geologists, hydrologists, all those folks with that expertise. We're going to lock them in a room for a few days, and we're going to ask them some questions about, recharge. What can we say? What does the science tell us? And we have firm standing that we can say about recharge. And so what came out of that was that on average, we can safely say that recharge happens about 3 inches per year, and that water that's reaching the aquifer is cleaner, going through a playa and going through its natural process than it would be otherwise. And that amount of recharge is not enough really, to make up for what's being taken out, but for irrigation, but it can be enough for individual water use, for the people on that landscape, and even for towns. Because once you start adding up 3 inches per year and the number of playas that are in that landscape, it does become a significant number, and it is enough for people. It's not enough to make up for what's being lost through irrigation, but it starts to get people's attention when you say, if we restored 50% of the playas in this county, that would be enough water for nearly 90% of the population in this county. So that starts to resonate with people. And so the city of Clovis, New Mexico is kind of where this idea got started. The city folks are working on a water plan back in 2016, and they're still working on it. But they understood that playas may be a part of their restoration efforts and their water sustainability plans that they had for their city. And so they invited us to come and talk about playas and restoration and science and things like that. And that really kind of started the model that we are thinking about using for other places and that we are exporting to other places. Next slide, please. So Clovis got to thinking, okay, there's a lot of playas around Clovis. It's an important part of their water sustainability solution, and they have a declining aquifer that they're dealing with. How many more towns like that, like Clovis, are out there that we could approach with this kind of concept? And so it's like any kind of conservation effort, you kind of have to ask yourself, is it scalable? It may work great in one area, but can you really scale it up? So we took a look at this and looked at the towns within this region where the aquifer is and where it's declining and where it's getting very low, and also where there are playas near towns that could play a potential part of the recharge for the water use for those towns. And so actually where there's a high density of playas, aquifer's low, near a town, when those things came together, actually there was about 56 towns just like Clovis within our region. And so that really gave us kind of a roadmap where to go next, and start talking about this idea about recharge and playa restoration near towns and for water for people. So next slide, please. So one of the towns we went to was a little town in Kansas called Leoti. It has a few hundred people in it, but it's a pretty nice little community. It has, ag based, of course, but it's still thriving, still surviving. But, they're facing a real water shortage in that town due to the amount of water that's being used through irrigation. And we came together and started talking about this and brought our ideas about playa restoration and how that can help contribute to water. And then that blossomed into, okay, well, let's do something like an RCPP project through NRCS, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. And let's do a project and let's focus on playa restoration and also irrigation water management for irrigation in the town and near the town and the community. So we're focusing on both. So what that effectively did was it brought applied conservation to the table, to the conservation or conversation around water conservation in general. So talking about irrigation efficiency and water use reduction and maybe retiring wells and things like that. So that all of a sudden brought all these different partners together to work on this. Now, if we went in and started talking about birds, all these groups of people would probably not have been at the table because that's not really their thing, and that would not have been relevant to them. But we start talking about water, then that's a little different. Next slide. So how do you know if this is working, if it's succeeding or not? Well, when they call you, when they offer funds, resources, time, and when they're your ambassador, you're succeeding. And when you are supporting, have more of a supporting role rather than leading, you're pushing rather than pulling people, and you're trying to keep up with them, and you're their ambassador, you're really starting to succeed. And when you're working together, you're working on what you have in common and not debating about, what you're going to do next. And you just kind of do it, you know, in short, everything is just easier when you're succeeding. So that's kind of how you know. And it was kind of funny, one of the members of the community that we work with, that was a real champion for us, our ambassador. He kind of came to us aside after a meeting and said, "Are you guys getting what you need for birds?" Because he knew we were bird people and stuff. And we're like, "We're fine. Yes, yeah, we're fine. We're getting it. We're getting the plies restored. That's the whole point. We're not talking about birds or anything like that, but we're talking about water, and that's what's important to people." So next slide, and we'll wrap this up. So just parting thoughts, I guess, your relevance starts the very moment you start solving and understanding other people's problems. And sometimes we spend a little bit too much time trying to make our problems relevant to other people, where we need to be focusing more on other people's problems. And so hopefully this is not just a one-off kind of situation. I think the idea and the concept anyway can really apply to just about any situation where you really listen to people and hear what they have to say and what their concerns are. And that's when you find your relevance. So thank you.
Thanks, Matt. What an awesome example. And I know as the social scientist with Road to Recovery, I get asked a lot, how do we get people to care about birds? And not only birds, but usually this one specific bird. And my answer is usually, well, do we need them to? And there are other social science researchers on the call, and that question is really interesting. And sometimes we do, and we're really interested in how we do that. But to get to a conservation goal, we don't always. And so taking the time, as you said, to listen, to understand what are the priorities of the people who need to be engaged in this process and who make the decisions on the land where we need to work, what are those priorities? And if it's not birds, what is it? And how do we incorporate and engage? So awesome example. I hope others also took note of that human dimensions engagement timeline. It can take some time, but it's really worth it to invest that time and to do the listening and the learning and build the partnerships. So thanks, Matt, for sharing that example. Our next two speakers for part 2 are from the New England Forestry Foundation. So I will introduce both Colleen Ryan and Christine Parrish now, and then turn it over to you all. Colleen Ryan is a forest scientist for the New England Forestry Foundation, where she provides scientific support to the foundation's work spreading forestry that improves outcomes for wildlife, people, and the climate. Colleen is a forester with experience in ecological modeling, forest restoration, landscape planning for wildlife, and science communication. And Colleen will be joined today by Christine Parrish. Christine leads the New England Forestry Foundation's Western Maine Forest Habitat Restoration Initiative, which provides forest management and native wildlife habitat technical assistance to family and nonprofit forest landowners in an RCPP with the National Resource Conservation Service. Through the partnership, the NRCS is providing funds to do active management on over 20,000 acres of non-industrial forest in the Acadian Forest in Western Maine. Christine has a degree in natural resources from Cornell University and spent a decade working as a wildlife, bird, forestry, and fisheries biotechnician for federal agencies before earning a master's in writing and communication. Prior to joining the foundation in 2019, Christine spent 20 years as a print journalist specializing in foreign policy, humanitarian, and conservation issues, and she's based in rural Maine. So Colleen and Christine, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. Yeah, we're really happy to be here and learning so much from all of you today. I'm going to give sort of a big picture overview of NEF's approach to managing habitat for wildlife and birds in particular. And my slides are not advancing. Wonder what's happening. Oh, there we go. Did that go? Yeah. Okay.
That's good.
So yeah, sorry about that. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on New England Forestry Foundation, which we call for short NEF, for those of you who might not be familiar with us. We're an organization that was founded 80 years ago to promote the spread of sustainable forest management practices in New England. So we're a land trust. We own 150 community forests all across New England, which are the green dots that you see on the map there. And we also have conservation easements on over 1 million acres of working forest land in New England. In addition to that conservation work, we also work with other landowners to teach and promote what we call exemplary forestry. We currently have 2 major projects going to working with private landowners, including a $30 million grant that we got from the USDA's Climate Smart Commodities program. And that allows us to give financial assistance to private and tribal landowners to help them practice better forestry for the climate and wildlife. And we also advocate for better forest policy to support all these goals. So central to our mission is a set of practices that we call exemplary forestry. And we've defined 2 sets of exemplary forestry standards for the 2 major forest regions of New England. And those standards take a landscape approach to forest management aimed at 3 co-equal goals, which are mitigating climate change, improving wildlife habitat, and producing more and better quality wood, which not only benefits local economies, but also circles back to the climate goal, because we feel that society should be shifting to a bio-based economy. And that requires providing bio-based materials like wood instead of using the fossil fuel-based materials. So I'm going to give you kind of our high-level approach to how we think about wildlife habitat management. The standards say that we should be managing forests at a landscape scale to provide habitat for the full range of native wildlife species that are found in New England. And we do this by managing for a set of umbrella wildlife species. So this table shows you the 3 major habitat types that we've identified in our the central and transition hardwood forest region, which is the type of forest that covers most of southern New England. And so for each of those major habitat types, we've identified these candidate species, which you'll see includes quite a few birds, partly because they are, engaging for people, and partly because their habitat needs are well known. These species were designated in consultation with regional wildlife experts. And I'll just give you a few, highlight of what those habitat types look like. So for that forest type, we designated the 3 major habitat types are interior habitat, early successional forest habitat, and then the edge and transition habitats. And we think that if we manage for these 3 sets of species, that's going to cover the habitat needs of most of the species in New England. So how do we implement this? As you saw that map that Joe showed where the Maine is almost entirely privately owned, so is the rest of New England. And the southern half of Maine is mostly small family forest owners. And that's true of pretty much the rest of New England also. We have thousands of individual small family forest landowners. So managing from a landscape scale is a challenge in that environment. But of course, we know that that's what we need to do if we're going to meet the needs of the wildlife. So on the plus side, unlike maybe some other parts of the country or other landowner groups, we found that these small family forest owners are very interested in managing for wildlife, and especially birds. So we can use wildlife as a way to encourage better management. So here's an example of how we try to go about approaching this landscape scale management. We have a key focus area called the Mountains of the Don region, which is in northwestern Maine, and it's where Christine does a lot of her work. And we did a systematic habitat needs assessment of that region. And brought in a bunch of experts and found 14 key missing features that are either missing or underrepresented on the landscape. So these are things like complex forest structures, really big live and dead standing trees, high quality early successional habitat. And so when we're looking at managing either our own lands or working with other landowners, we look at this list of needs and we say, what can this parcel provide? How can we manage to kind of make up for some of these deficits on the landscape? And then on top of that, we can look at the surrounding landscape and say, what's missing in the area that we could contribute on this parcel? Or what can we complement with this parcel? What can we link to that's in the nearby landscape? And so that's kind of just how we think about it. And Christine's going to give you a little more detail on how we work with landowners and to implement this on the ground. So over to you, Christine. Let's go back to this map.
Yeah, thanks. I think, thanks, Colleen. I think Joe's also going to share a map, but that's a good place to start too. First of all, before I dive in, I want to say a couple of things just to highlight. First of all, I'm really glad for the invitation to be on this. Joe, thank you, and Katie, thank you. But I also want to point out what Sarah Barker and Matt Smith said. Matt about relevance, Sarah about steps to consider, because those are sort of the approaches I use. And so it's sort of great that they came first, because I'm going to be talking very specifically. I cancel the Spanish on me, I guess. Over here, I've got some little note. So I'm going to be talking very specifically about the region that I'm working in under an RCPP, Regional Conservation Partnership Program with the NRCS in Western Maine. And so I'm working in the area that, in Joe's map might show it a little bit better, Colleen, if Joe has that prepped and ready to go. The area that I'm working in is about 7 million acres. And I work directly with family forest landowners and with some land trust owners as well. And that area is 4 counties in Western Maine that goes basically from New Hampshire and the Quebec border over from sort of up the Appalachian chain, up to through Moosehead Lake, if you know Maine, and then up to Baxter and that whole area there. And if Joe can share that map, he will, I'm sure. This area just, you know, in this approach, this RCPP, we took the exemplary forestry approach that Neff had, sort of wood, wildlife, and climate, that triad approach to forest management, co-equal approach, and cross-referenced it with the conservation forestry practices that were habitat, that also served to improve habitat through the NRCS. So to make it practical, we took exemplary forestry, we cross-referenced it with the NRCS cost share, and then you know, there's a lot more to that went into that, but then we went out to recruit landowners, about 3,000 acres worth of landowners, from initial interest to actual implementation on the ground. So through the planning process to implementation, going in there to create forest complexity on the ground, focusing on some of the practices that Colleen highlighted. So to do this, in 2019, when I was hired, the first RCPP, we're on the second one now. The first RCPP, our goal was 3,000 acres. Like I said, we ended up with 12,000. Now, the second RCPP, our goal was 3,000. We're going to end up with 12,000 applied management around that on this one as well. And so I just want to sort of focus on how we got there, from me starting saying, how do I get landowners not only interested in planning, but also committing to a 30-year stewardship pledge, which is sort of a Girl Scout promise, and then actually going in, signing the contracts, and preparing to do the work. That's a lot to move people from interest to action. And so I can't say enough about Sally Stockwell at Maine Audubon, Forestry for Maine Birds, one of my first partners when I started on this project. and working with the American Forest Foundation, it sort of helped sort of move this forward. Sally had been working with landowners in Western Maine to do forest management plans. And, you know, I sort of aligned with that, and then quickly realized that some of what I could do was just sort of work with her directly as she was doing that outreach and talk to the landowners she was talking to that seemed the most motivated, and then sort of carry on the conversation with them, start to build that longer term relationship and trust, so that we could get to these hurdles of like, how do you get to a 30-year pledge that, you know, I'm going to work on the property. So that was one avenue that really worked. And we have a continuing relationship with Maine Audubon. Very happy to have it. Also with Joe. Joe and I started working together to do outreach, aligning outreach towards landowners, having those conversations about who might fit, who would be a good, where, you know, who was interested, and how we could move forward with that. But I quickly realized, you know, that's really difficult, that getting from the interest to planning, and then all the way to on that continuum to action on the ground, and that longer term commitment, that I needed to go sort of really take a design build approach to outreach. Like, if it's working, keep going. If it's not working, reframe and decide how to move forward. So the first thing I did, and I only have a few minutes. I'm really just gonna do a few highlights here. But the first thing I did around Western Maine, that Western Maine is about, you know, it has the overlap of the New England the Northeast hardwoods type with the boreal forest, as you know, lots of richness of habitat there, mostly commercial lands. There's 2 major roads, and they're only 2-lane roads. There's maybe 10,000 people across those 7 million acres. It's mostly trees. Honestly, it's 96% trees, but the complexity is missing. So there's lots of opportunity, but some of that opportunity with the private landowners is in between the other land ownerships, the big land ownerships that are largely commercial, but not solely. There's conservation lands in there too. So I saw those individual pieces as sort of jigsaw puzzle pieces in the landscape view of what we were trying to do using this landscape scale approach of forest management. And I did a very quick sort of demographic assessment. What, you know, what's the age of these folks? How do they access information? You know, how do they share information? You know, sort of ownership demographics and those kinds of things. And I very quickly realized that this was an older population, some folks who weren't living on the land, and I do have absentee landowners or that are not living right on their property amongst the group I'm working with. And that most of them still relied on print, on Facebook, somewhat on radio. They talked to the local people they trusted, and they got information from flyers at the local convenience gas beer store, as well as the local bank, the grocery store, and the dump, the landfill or recycling center. So I did everything. I did newspaper ads, very visual ones, very simple across the area. I did a little bit of radio spots. I continued working with Sally and some of that outreach. And then I also started to think about, you know, how I could use the landowners I was getting to create these peer landowner groups so they could do some of the outreach for me, and also start to connect the pieces across the landscape, particularly around areas where I knew there was high habitat value. I also used birds quite a lot. I would use specific bird species to engage people. I've talked a lot about the Canada warbler, as Sally Stockwell knows, became one of my favorite birds to talk about. And sort of these different approaches, and including if I saw a property that I could see could fit into a 2 or 3 ownership peer group, I didn't hesitate to cold call or ask to be introduced. And, you know, it took one landowner, it took me 2 years to get him to answer my calls, but now he's in, and he's part of a 3,000 acre group among 3 landowners that connect permanent conservation land and a major river in that part of the state. So it worked. And so I know I'm probably running out of time. So I just want to tell you about sort of that engagement, that relevance that Matt was talking about, and how that can build trust and sort of simplify a very complicated process. So you meet people where they are, listen to them and what they care about, find where that cross-reference is, and then start to connect their interest not only within what we can offer, but also what other partners can offer, whether it's beginning with Habitat, Maine Audubon, Maine Forest Service, other folks, and also across the landscape, sort of build that stewardship ethic. Like how do you fit? How does your family and your legacy fit into what you can contribute for habitat across this landscape? And do it in a practical way that focuses on forest management so that it can fit into existing frameworks for doing good work on the ground. I've probably run out, so I think I'll stop there.
It's fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing, both of you. We will have time for some more questions and engagement on these topics. I think these are all such important ones to cover. I love the example of 2 years to engage that one landowner, but how critical that one person is. And I always talk about with social science research, I do have a quantitative brain. I really value statistics, but this concept of being able to get rid of our outliers, it just doesn't translate to working with landowners. And one person, even though very challenging to engage, really worth the 2 years of work. And then you mentioned those peer-to-peer landowner groups and how important all of that is. But again, it takes time and it takes investment in that trust building. Thank you so much. What an awesome example. We're to our last presenter of part 2, and then we'll open it up for some questions. So again, feel free to drop those into the chat now if they're in mind. Elisa Donovan is from the Coastal Prairie Conservancy. So Elisa is the Vice President and General Counsel of the Coastal Prairie Conservancy, a land trust in Texas that protects natural and agricultural lands in the Texas Gulf Coast region. As a reformed energy attorney, she has transferred her legal and project management expertise to lead 2 regional partnerships to conserve imperiled prairie ecosystems by working with private landowners on land management and conservation easement projects. Thanks so much for being with us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks. It's really great to be here. I also just want to mention I am also a private landowner. My husband and I have a little farm ranch, and we took advantage of the Pastures for Upland Bird program that Will Newman talked about early on to restore our own little prairie grasslands. And it is amazing to see. It does make a difference. We now have flocks of meadowlarks visiting right now. Loggerhead shrikes are not an uncommon sight. We have a pair of painted buntings that were spending several months with us this kind of late spring, and scissortail flycatchers. We used to see one here and there. Now we see so many. So it really is, it does make a difference to do these on the ground practices. You can see the results. So it is great to have that story of hope. So the Coastal Prairie Conservancy, we were formerly the Katy Prairie Conservancy. We started off as a land trust, mostly owning lands kind of on the edge of Houston there on Harris and Waller County, if you can see on my map. And as that, we're a land manager. We often, are working to restore our own lands that we own. We have taken advantage of the Cornell Lab bird funding to do some restoration and education activities. So that's been appreciated, and we continue to work on that. It's just a never-ending process to keep your land managed for the habitat that we like. And our goal as a land trust, we realized, beyond the Katy Prairie, there was a much broader area where there weren't a lot of land conservation happening. So we changed our name to the Coastal Prairie Conservancy, and now we're working in a 9-county region. We protect over 32,000 acres in Southeast Texas. So our mission is about preserving coastal prairies, but it's about wetlands, it's farms, it's ranches, it's people, wildlife, it's agriculture. And when we look at our strategic goals of land conservation, trying to duplicate those large connected areas so that we can really maintain the ecosystem. It's much better to protect 5,000 or 10,000 acres that are contiguous than to have sort of a scattershot approach across the region. So with that mentality, we really pursued these partnerships. So, the question is, and I love prior speaker's point, like, how do you get from, concept to implementation? How do we get from here? Look at this land, the birds use it. It's right at the edge of our preserved habitat. You can't see on this picture, but there's subdivisions like on the horizon. They're not mountains. There's houses back there. So how do we protect what we have to keep it for wildlife? And how do we get to here? This lady here on the left, she's the landowner who owned a little over 100 acres that was on the edge, and she had plans to develop it, but after a long time, years of conversations and trust building and finding access to funding programs, we were able to negotiate a purchased agricultural land easement and get it to closing. So this is our closing. So this is what we're trying to get to. Me as a former energy attorney, I'm very much driven to get the deal closed. And so this is to me the most satisfying thing to hit this point. And so these two initiatives that I'm discussing are also funded by the Regional Conservation Partner Program of NRCS. So we did two initiatives. The first was the Texas Coastal Prairie Initiative. It was focused on not just the 9 counties where we work, but we had 13 counties because there's a number of other partners that are also working on the coastal prairie. So you can see basically we got on our phone and on email and called up everyone that we've worked with that we know is interested in this ecosystem. There's a number of other land trusts. There's Audubon, Texas. There's our local county that had some, interest in conserving land, maybe more for parks or flood mitigation. There's, the A&Ms of the world that are interested in land conversion, land loss. Anyways, Texas Parks and Wildlife, Texas General Land Office, they're interested in resiliency planning. So we really did work with everyone that's active in the region that might bring something to the table to help pull the initiative off. And then for the Grasslands and Savannas initiative, which they're overlapping. We realized we needed more money. The first grant was $7 million. It's not enough. Land is too expensive. And there were other areas. So we applied for a second one while we were still in the first one to do the Texas Grasslands and Savannas initiative. And we had a lot of the same partners, but we had some new partners that were working a little bit more inland. It's funded by the Inflation Reduction Act. So we have like a carbon measurement component to it. And so we have the two projects going on simultaneously. Oops. So just big picture, I mean, the great thing about these programs, it is meaningful money that can make a difference. For the Coastal Prairie Initiative, it was a $7 million grant, and not quite 5 million of it was dedicated for conservation easement funding that gets paid to the landowner for cost share assistance for the easement. It pays 50% of the value of the conservation easement. For the Grasslands and Savannas Initiative, we received a $25 million grant, and almost 17 million of it is for easement funding. We also have a pretty significant component that is land management funding, and this is to do beneficial practices. And similar, we looked at the practices, okay, what do landowners need and what is going to be helpful to accomplish our goals, which for the coastal prairie, it really is about protecting habitat for the priority species that we had identified. For the Grasslands Initiative, we were looking at climate smart practices because it's about carbon and grassland and soil carbon health, but also what is beneficial for habitat for grassland birds. So we have a select list of practices that we can give funding to landowners if they're able to implement them. And then lastly, we work with partners. We're not planners. We're not out there telling landowners how they might manage their land, but we certainly have a great partner. In our case, it's WHF Wildlife Habitat Federation has been really good to go out and develop conservation plans that meet the requirements of NRCS so that they can, listen to the landowner. What are their goals for the land? A lot of them are cattle ranchers and they need to have a profitable cattle operation. And if they can get some funding to do some practices such as cross fencing or removing invasive species, perhaps reseeding with native grasses, it not only helps the bird habitat, it also helps their bottom line and their cattle management. This is truly a partnership. So we, look for the whole program. We start with the conservation plans. I'm not a biologist. I'm not a lawyer. We looked at all the conservation plans that existed in our area. We use that to identify the priority areas that we may want to conserve. We have outreach teams. We've done a conference. We've done other landowner workshops discussing things like restoration, et cetera. Part of our team does the prioritization and selection. So when we identify potential projects, we have to make sure we pick the ones that most meet the objectives of our programs. And then we need to implement the project. So we're not the only land trust that's working on this. Of all of the projects that we have had funded with the Coastal Prairie Initiative, the Coastal Prairie Conservancy has one, and then there's 2 other land trusts that have the other 5. For the Grasslands and Savannas Initiative, we're in our first round, and we have 1, and then there's 2 other projects that are with 2 other land trusts. So it really is a partnership. It's not, all Coastal Prairie Conservants. We've all come together to pick the best projects. And then there's a reporting component for species and outcomes for the Coastal Prairie Initiative. And then we're also having to do some carbon sequestration reporting for the Grasslands Initiative. So planning, I think when we were talking about this program, the question was, okay, how do we go from these plans and recognizing that there's bird loss and we have to do something? So, what are we going to do? So we didn't try to plan again. We just looked at the existing plans, and you can see them. They're here on our website. If you go to prairiepartner.org, we went ahead and put links in there to all of what we thought were relevant bird plans in our area that that describe habitat or needs of the species in our Texas Gulf Coast region. And then we sort of overlaid them on a map. We said, okay, there's some conserved lands here. There's, these other habitats have been identified as priority areas, and talk with our partners to try to get contiguous areas, kind of like our Katy Prairie Preserve, where we can really connect the conservation lands together. That's not to say if it's outside one of these areas, we wouldn't consider it, but the goal was really to have those contiguous, landscape level conservation. For the Grasslands and Savannas Initiative, it's more focused on carbon. So we looked at our map and we talked with our partners, and we wanted to go inland and get some truly upland grassland habitat. And you can see there's hardly any conservation lands in that more inland upland area. You can see on the coast, we have the National Wildlife Refuges, and there's a number of conserved properties along the riparian areas, but very, very little conserved lands in these open grassland areas. And so working with our partners, we identified particularly this Texas Blackland Prairie area that needed to be included as our focus region. And if you remember Will's map of Texas, in the triangle and the, threat of development, that is dark gray. Like that is an area that is under incredibly high threat of development. These large tracts are being converted to, if not, thousands of homes, they're being converted into 10-acre little ranchettes, or, these kind of little getaway properties. And it's, as we all say, in Texas, is, too big to mow, not enough to. So I don't know, there's a saying, and it applies here. So it's not quite big enough to really be a working ranch, but it's too small, to provide really great habitat. So on the outreach, listening to the landowners, we also find, that people respond to kind of old school communication. So we have gone to postcards, and they have been very effective. We can do database searches of our county property appraisal districts. identify those landowners that have more than, say, 100 acres, particularly if you look at a priority area, you can do sort of a GIS delineated search to send targeted mailings if you want to focus on a priority area, or just across the entire region, if those landowners meet a certain acreage size. So we have been doing that, and it's been really effective. You know, we get these people that are like, gosh, I received this postcard and it was like the answer to my prayers. You know, like this woman literally said that because they'd been stressed out about their property and their inheritance issues, and how might they be able to you know, get a little bit of funds out of their property so that they might keep it preserved, but still be able to, you know, get the funds that they needed to live. So we also have flyers that we can email, or we can print them out. We have a website. We've done events. So this Lands and Legacies conference we just held this fall, and it was quite successful. We again sent postcards out to our landowners. We ended up with more than 60 landowners, which was great. Oftentimes our little prairie community seems a little insular. We talked to each other, and we really leaned in to try to get the cattle people and, you know, the ranchers. And it's not just about the birds. It's about landowners. You can use this QR code to see our website. It has a lot of great information. This is specifically for our initiative. We wanted it to be landowner friendly, so they could, you know, hear in plain English, hopefully, you know, as plain as it could be, about what sort of programs might be available to them. This map, you know, we kind of leaned in again to the kind of Western Lands and Legacies. So you can see little longhorns, windmills, hay bales, you know, getting that country feeling that it does seem to be that landowners, if they're, you know, generational landowners, they have this feeling of wanting to keep their legacy. And then the new landowners like the idea of preserving that Texas heritage. This is where we get all in the weeds, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we do have a whole screening program where we try to identify those projects that best meet the objectives. We have a number of species that are our priority species, so there's points allocated, and are they in a area that's you know, high focus area? What's the vegetation like? So that we can prioritize the lands that provide the best habitat. That's for conservation easements. And then there's a worksheet where they have to fill it out. And it's not that hard. It's, you know, 4 pages, and usually the land trust will fill it out for them if they want to be considered for funding. Habitat management is similar. So right now, the Texas Coastal Prairie Initiative, we were awarded in 2021. We kicked off funding in 2022, and we've done 3 rounds, and we have pretty much spent it all. We're still waiting to obligate and close projects, but they are all committed right now. So we have 6 projects that have been deemed eligible. It's over 5,000 acres, and it's 4.5 million. We have a little bit of funds left. And then for our Grasslands and Savannas initiative, we just kicked it off this year. So far, we have 3 projects eligible over 768 acres, part of which is really important to us. It's connecting our Katy Prairie. There was a hole in it, and this is filling in a really critical hole, and over $6 million in funding. For land management, there's a lot more projects. So we have 20 projects there's habitat management. Over 30,000 acres are being benefited with improved habitat management practices. And then under the Grasslands and Savannas initiative, we have 9 projects over 7,000 acres. And our thought, you know, we're a land trust, we're not really about habitat management, but it is a great conversation starter with the landowner to say, you know what, we have funds available to help you manage your lands. We, for free, can have one of our partners develop a conservation plan for you. They can decide, you know, they can help you decide what you want to do, and they can help you find funding to get it done, so you don't have to pay all of the costs to do it. And it's just it's hard, you know, when landowners hear about that, they're like, oh, why wouldn't I do that? And it starts the conversation. And our hope is that would lead to eventually that they'd want to do a conservation easement. And it's also worked the other way. Every time we do a conservation easement, even a donated easement, we'll say, hey, by the way, we'll help you do a management plan, no cost to you, and we'll help you get some funding to improve the habitat. And we can be assured, especially for those conservation easement lands, they'll never be developed and the habitat will be improved. So that's what I have, and look forward to hearing everybody's questions.
Thanks so much. Another fantastic example. And I think we've heard a lot of consistent themes throughout all of the presentations today. It's not one organization who's responsible for private land engagement. It takes a team, and not only a team, but takes the right team. And so I think, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time for questions today. But there are continued opportunities for engagement. And so first, I will follow up with everyone who has been on the call and who registered for the call. I'll share the contact information that was shared for all of our presenters today. There will also be a recording of this session available on the Road to Recovery website. That will be linked in my email follow-up to all of you. If you have other questions or would like to continue these conversations with our fantastic speakers for today. At the beginning of the session, I neglected to thank our amazing translator. Belen, thank you so much for joining us and allowing us to make this session as accessible as possible. We really appreciate your brilliance and your being able to translate like this on the spot for us. It's really broadened our bird conservation community and the conversations we're able to have through these sessions. So thank you so much. Thank you to Shane and Bradley, to AFWA and to NABC for co-sponsoring this event, this session with myself and Road to Recovery. I think all of our organizations are really committed to building partnerships across the bird conservation community and really coming together. I think we all see that's what it's going to take to recover bird populations. We want to be facilitators of that where we can. So it was great to work with both of you on this. Hope we can continue to engage on this topic. Thank you to our fantastic speakers. You are the reason that this topic is of such high interest. I think a lot of the people on the call who are the regular audience of Road to Recovery, of NABC, of the bird conservation wings of AFWA, are the bird experts, right? They're the ornithologists, the biologists who are really engaged in learning about bird recovery, bird ecology, population biology. You can tell I'm not an ornithologist, but it's all of you who we need to connect with in order to really deliver the conservation. And so I hope to everyone watching, you've seen there are experts doing this work who know how to engage private landowners and know what it takes, have the skills to establish the trust, have the partnerships in place. So I hope it spurs some ideas of who may be good additions to species working groups, where you can reach out to partner for funding opportunities. Myself, Shane, and Bradley, we can be bridges there to connect you to these organizations or others like them. Of course, we couldn't cover the whole geography of the US in this session, but there are parallel organizations and wonderful people across all of the geographies where you're working. So let's work together to engage with private lands work to do the bird conservation recovery that we hope to do. So thank you all. You'll be hearing from me in follow-up. We'll end at 4 o'clock on the dot. Look forward to continued conversations. As I mentioned, this is part of a series through Road to Recovery on private lands conservation and bird recovery work. So there's more to come. So stay tuned. We look forward to engaging further. Thank you, everyone.